All right, welcome to Focus Like a Pro, and this is part of the Master Photography series. And today we're going to look at 3 different ways to autofocus using either a DSLR or a mirrorless digital camera. Depending on the model or how old your camera is really going to determine if you're going to have one of the options. But our first option is going to be something called focus and recompose. The second one is how to move your autofocus points. And the last one is going to be AI, where you let your camera identify the location of autofocus, such as subject or eye autofocus. So we have this image here, and what we're going to assume is that this black border that I've got around here, even though it's not the correct ratio, this is 16:9 and not 2:3, that's the frame or the viewfinder of our camera. And so typically your autofocus point will be right here in the center. And if I was to focus on this subject, well, it would focus on the background, and that's not what we want. We want this eye right up here to most likely be a critical area of focus. So we learned in the last video that we can control what this looks like. So do we have a single point, or do we have a large area? Now, depending on the type of photography that you use is going to be dependent on the type of method that you use. Now, method being this selection here. So just a quick review, and I think this is beneficial just to repeat some of this information, especially when you're learning. But 2 different ways to focus on a camera. First of all, we can use that front button. This is the way it comes default. You press it halfway down, it will autofocus. You press it the rest of the way down, and we'll take a picture. It's difficult, I think, for people to learn how to hold that halfway down so that the autofocus doesn't move. I suggest, and you will find that most people suggest, switching to the rear button. So this is a Nikon, Canon, any camera is going to have a rear button. They've been around for 25, 30 years. It's not something new. You need to go into your menu, reconfigure it, make it so this is your autofocus button. And so if you press it, it autofocuses. And if you release it, it doesn't autofocus. And it makes life a lot simpler. Next, we have our autofocus settings. So you're going to go into your autofocus settings, and you have 3 options most likely. One is going to be single, that when your camera focuses and it locks on, it's going to stop trying to autofocus. That's good for portraits or non-moving objects. Continuous. This is where your camera will continually track your subject. So even if it's not moving, it's going to try to keep tracking that subject. The last one is AI, and basically the camera is going to determine itself whether it uses single or continuous. Now, if you switch to the rear button, I suggest you do continuous, and this is why. If you're using that independent button and you have a non-moving subject, you just press the button. When it's in focus, you let go. That's just like single. However, if the subject starts to run around, you just hit the button again and it will continually to track them. So I kind of get the best of both worlds, and I have control over the situation, which in the AI versions or Matrix or whatever the different brands call, you don't have the choice. The last thing here are just the methods. And so these are important, and depending on what you photograph is really going to be dependent on what you do. I have noticed that when students are starting out, that they tend to like the large areas because it's easy for them to get the subject on the point. If you're using just that small spot point up here, sometimes it can be difficult to keep it on the subject. And so they struggle with that. However, I actually prefer the smallest point or a medium point. I very rarely use the whole area. Now, I do use the whole area with subject and eye tracking, but that's a different story. What you need to do is try them and see how they work for you in what you're photographing. That's going to make a big difference. What you're photographing, one of these different points is going to be better for you than the other. So we've got our Canon methods. So we have our Nikon methods, and there's a lot here. We have our Sony methods. and we're going to come back here. So this is our point or single point or 1 point, depending on which brand and which icon you're using. It doesn't matter if we do this tutorial in using Nikon, Canon, or Sony icons. The idea is the same with all of them. There's spot or 1 point, there's an expanded area, then there's a wide area. All right, so we are in method number 1, and this is going to be a spot or a 1 point method, okay? So whether your icon differs, it doesn't make a difference. It's a spot or 1 point. And we know if we focus now, it's going to focus on the blackboard. So in this method, we're going to do something called focus and recompose. In this situation, we're not going to move this focus point. It's going to stay right here. What we're going to do is move the camera so that this focus point is now on the area that we want to focus on, which is this side. So I'm going to move this. And when I move this, it's going to shift the composition that we have framed here. And this is typical that your subject isn't in your center. And you can tell beginning photographers because everything's in the center because they don't know how to move the focus point. But we'll go to the next slide and you can see this is me shifting the camera. So it's moving the composition how we don't want it, but it's putting the focus point where we want. All right, we focus and then we just recompose and we're back to where we were. We let go of that back button and we can take the picture. So what we did was shift the camera, come back, take the picture. So that's what we call focus and recompose. And I actually use this all the time when I'm doing portraits or non-moving subjects. Now, there's situations where, yeah, this does not work. The next method is going to be to move that autofocus point. And so if you're using the spot, the single point, or the smaller expanded, those methods you're going to be allowed to move that focus point around the viewfinder. So it's going to be here and we can move it anywhere that we want to move it. So how do we do that? Canon's is the most complicated. So what you need to do is you need to tap this button. Sometimes that button's up here, meaning this button is here and this button is here, but it's this button. It's always on the back. You tap it and then up, down, right, left. Okay? And that will move it in any of those directions. If you have an older DSLR camera, use this to move left and right and your wheel that spins to go up and down. Also, if you have a touchscreen display, whether it's Canon, Nikon, Sony, whatever brand, you are also able to just touch the back of the screen and that's where your focus point will move to. So instead of moving this, you can just tap to the location you want it to go and voila, it's there. Nikon's is easy. Once you get into one of the modes that allows you to move it, all you need to do is tap this wheel. So up, down, left, right, and the focus point will move around. Sony's is easy as well, though I've never used it. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to put it in a mode that allows you to move it, and then you're going to tap the wheel to move that autofocus point, just like we did on Nikon. So in this one, we've got one of those slightly expanded, so it's a little bit bigger area. And we're going to move that focus point this time to our new location. So we're not going to recompose or move the camera, we're moving the focus point. So usually this goes in steps. It will go like here, here, up here, like that, okay? So it'll go jumps. So we're going to move it and boom, it's now on our subject. Now, using an expanded focus point like this, it might actually focus on the tip of her nose. So if you have a really shallow depth of field, this might not work for you. It's not going to give you as critical focus as single points or pinpoints will, but it should work in general, all right? So this is a good method to use. But you can see what we did is we just moved that point to the new location. We didn't move the camera or the composition in the viewfinder. We're just moving that focus point. Now we have one of the pinpoint icons, and just like we did before, we can move that pinpoint to the new location. Remember, it's not going to move like this. It's going to go bump, 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 bump like that. And you can do this pretty quick once you get used to it. So you're just going to take that pinpoint and move it to the new location. Now, sometimes as you're autofocusing, it will change colors. So it might turn red, it might turn green, it might blink. It depends on the camera manufacturer, but it usually is going to do something so you can see it inside the viewfinder. So our next one is using artificial intelligence of the camera, and this is going to either identify subjects or eyes. So we can identify animals, cars, planes, people. Usually there's a variety of things that it will say, but you need to set the option. So in this case, we might have a wide area where it's looking at the whole screen, but the camera is going to pick the subject. So in this situation, the camera is going to move the point automatically onto an eye if we're using people, eye autofocus. Remember, this is set in the menu. Now, what happens if it goes on this eye and you want this eye? Well, usually you can just tap that same wheel to the right and it will go here. Tap it to the left, it will go back. Tap it to the right, it will go back. All right, so you can move it. So same thing with subject autofocus. If it's on the wrong person, you can just tap and it will try to acquire the other person. All right, so we have a little dog and we have him right in the center of the frame, and it's really easy. You just press the focus button and it should be in focus. Now what happens in a lot of times is a lot of photography is an asymmetrical image. It's not symmetrical like this. So your subject's going to be off to one side. You can't focus and recompose because if you tried to do that, by the time you would recompose, the dog would probably have already run past you and it'd be too late. So in this situation, we have to move that focus point, and we either need to do it manually, or if we have one of the automatic ones, we can use the automatic ones. So we need to go boom and move it to a side. So if we're using, in this case, we're going to, this in spot, but I've expanded. And the reason some people might find expanded is this spot might be difficult for you to hold on the subject if it's moving erratically. This is a little bit easier because it's larger, but you're not going to be sure whether the focus is going to be here, here, here. It really kind of depends where that focus point is. So we're going to move that focus point. Now, if we want to use the AI and look, this symbol is never going to pop up like this, okay? It's just signifying what we're doing. We're looking at this whole area and it's trying to identify a dog, all right? Not the eye of the dog, just the subject. So what will happen is this little focus point, and once again, it will not be this icon. It's usually just a little square or rectangle or something that blinks. And as that dog moves, it will try to lock on to that position. Just like in animals, the people one will do the same thing. It will lock on a person. And so in this case, it's locking on this person here. I only have it low. It would most likely lock on up here just so you can see it. But what if we wanted the groom back here in the back? Well, we would just tap that button to the left and that would say to the camera, hey, not that person, the one over there. So it would move and focus on that guy. Obviously, this is a still image. I can't refocus it, but the camera would refocus on him and she would be slightly out of focus. This is more of what it's going to look like, and usually the symbol's a little bit smaller than this, but I need to make it large so you guys can see what's going on. And so I know a lot of cameras have this kind of blinking icon that signifies where it is, so it's easy to find in that viewfinder. So the best thing I can tell you is to learn how to move your focus point manually. If you have the eye or subject focuses and that's what you use, wonderful, great, go ahead and use them. If you have an older camera, learn how to do that focus and recompose. It's faster than moving the point at times. But the most important thing is just to learn how to use it. The better you get with the different options, the better focus you're going to get. And look, high-end cameras have more options. They have different ways in which the autofocus works for subjects that move erratically, subjects that spin. So it doesn't refocus on objects when they pass in front of what you're focused on. They do all kinds of crazy things. But for right now, you just want to learn which one of these points works best for the type of photography that you use and what situations. So you can sit there and think about the composition and what's going on rather than the technical aspects of the camera. So if you found this video helpful, that would be great if you could give us a thumbs up. It takes me a long time to make all those little icons. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below, and don't forget to subscribe.